So there was a pretty famous Buddhist monk from Thailand named Ajahn Chah, who in the 20th century did a lot to spread awareness of Buddhism in the West. And he once warned against doing what we're about to try to do. I'm about to try to explain the doctrine of not self or non-self or no self, the idea that in some sense the self, this thing we think of as being inside of us, does not exist. And Ajahn Chah once wrote that if you try to understand the doctrine in this way, by having somebody lecture about it or read about it, that, quote, your head will explode. Now, I assume he was exaggerating. I guess we'll find out soon enough. But he was pointing to an important distinction between two different ways of trying to apprehend this pretty hard to fathom idea. One is the way he warned against, reading about it, hearing about it. And the other is an experiential understanding of the doctrine. That is, sitting down and meditating and eventually maybe coming to kind of feel the truth of the doctrine, see the truth of no self, become convinced that there is no self in you. And it's certainly the case that most people I have seen who seem convinced that the doctrine is valid, that the self in some sense does not exist, are people who actually grasp the doctrine during meditation. And some of them say that it was transformative and has changed their lives. And their perspective on not self is a very important one. So eventually we're going to be hearing from some of them and hearing about some of these experiences that convince them that the self does not exist. But right now I'm going to try to describe the doctrine in the way that Ajahn Chah warned against. I'm just going to try to do it by what he called intellectualizing. I want to emphasize before we start that he was right. It's a very hard, infuriatingly hard doctrine to grasp in some ways. And it's even hard to understand what exactly the Buddha meant by the not-self idea. And scholars don't agree on exactly what he meant. And in fact, as we will see, the kind of mainstream interpretation of what he meant may not be true. I'm gonna kind of start by giving you more or less the mainstream, the kind of standard interpretation. But as we'll go on to see, that may not be valid, and it really matters which interpretation you buy into. Now, the Buddha laid out the idea of not self in a famous sermon, the Discourse on the Not Self, that is said to be the second sermon he delivered after his enlightenment. Remember, the first one was the Discourse on the Four Noble Truths, and then, according to tradition, he gave this Discourse on the Not Self, and it's a testament to the importance of the not self idea in Buddhist thought, that tradition holds it to be the second sermon he delivered. Another testament to the importance of the doctrine is that supposedly, in fact this is written in the account of the discourse, the monks in attendance were instantly enlightened once they heard this teaching about the not self. Okay, so what does the doctrine mean? Let's start to wrestle with that. This is the word in Sanskrit for not self. This is the word in the closely related ancient language of Pali. In both cases, the an just means not, so this means self, and the question arises, what exactly did the Buddha mean by the self? After all, it's a word you can use in a lot of different ways. And this was a long time ago. Who knows how exactly it was being used then? There are two ways to go about figuring out what the term meant. One is to kind of delve into the prevailing Indian philosophical discourse of the time and try to gather what the word would have meant to the Buddha. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to take what is in some ways a more straightforward course, which is we're going to try to infer what the Buddha meant by self from his argument against the self. So an analogy would be, if you were an archaeologist from a future civilization and you were coming across this term Santa Claus, but you didn't know what it meant, and then you came across a lecture I had delivered arguing that Santa Claus doesn't exist. And one thing I said was Santa Claus couldn't exist because no man can visit 1 million homes or more in a single night. Well then, if you were this archaeologist, you could infer this Santa Claus character must have been someone who was thought to visit 1 million or more homes in a night, right? That would be a valid inference. And we're going to do something comparable in assessing the Buddha's argument about not self, and we're going to infer from it the properties he associated with the self and how he seems to have thought of the self. Now, I want to, before we get into that, give you a kind of broad overview of the structure of the Buddha's argument. These are what are called the 5 aggregates. And according to Buddhist thought, they together constitute everything there is about a person, including the person's body, the person's mind, the person's experience. Everything is in one of these 5 aggregates. I'll run over them quickly, although the details don't matter much for today's purposes. Okay. Form, in principle, actually applies to anything physical in the world, but in this context, you can just think of it as being the body, the person's physical body. Feeling, we've talked about, pleasant, unpleasant. As we've said, by this term, the Buddha did not mean emotion. Emotion would be over here in mental formations, along with various other things, desires, volition, the kind of the energy that motivates willful action and thoughts and so on. Perception, of course, you know what perception is. Consciousness, the trouble with talking about consciousness is it's kind of hard to define. People have different conceptions of it. We won't get too deeply into it, but it refers to the phenomenon of subjective awareness. And the reason I've chosen to kind of draw it like this, give it a kind of privileged place in contact with all of these other things, is because the awareness is of these things. These things can be the contents of consciousness, so to speak, which isn't to say that these things are not in contact among themselves. So, for example, a perception can have a feeling associated with it, and so on. So what the Buddha basically does, according to the standard interpretation of this discourse on the not-self, is he goes through these aggregates, and he goes through each one, and he talks about the properties that the aggregate seems to have, and he says these properties are not compatible with the properties we associate with the self. The self could not be, show me where the self is. Could it be here, 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 here? And he concludes, no, it couldn't be, given what he asserts about the nature of these aggregates. So what does he assert? Well, there's basically 2 properties that he says you'll find in all of these aggregates. One of them is impermanence. Now, as we know, the Buddha saw impermanence everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere. Everything was impermanent. So certainly the 5 aggregates would be impermanent. And he goes around with the monks. He says, okay, what about form? What about feeling? Is it permanent or impermanent? The monks say, it is impermanent. And he says, well, in that event, if it is impermanent, if it is characterized by change, is it proper to call it self? And they say, no, it's not. And so we can infer from that he must have thought the self had a property roughly the opposite of impermanence. That's not necessarily to say that the self would last forever, but he seems to have thought of the self as something that persists through time. And that is consistent with the way we use the term, right? I mean, when I think of myself, I think of a self that was intact when I was 12 years old, and it's the same self I have now. I've changed a lot since I was 12, I'm in a lot of ways, but fundamentally there was some essence in me, I kind of think intuitively, some essence in me that accounts for a kind of continuity of identity. So we do think of the self in a commonsensical way as being something kind of solid, a kind of essence that endures through time, its structure endures. And the Buddha said, no, there's too much flux. Everything is changing all of the time in all of these aggregates. So it's hard to imagine a self being there. So one thing he's saying the self is kind of, it has this kind of substantial persistence. There's one other thing we can infer about his conception of the self from the argument he delivers here, and that is that the self is associated with control. And the way we know that is that the second basic argument he makes after the impermanence argument is, he goes around to the aggregates and he says, like feeling, for example, he says, if feeling were self, then feeling would not lead to affliction, and the deal would be that you could just say, may my feelings be like this, or may my feelings be like that. In other words, you could just control them. He says the same thing about the form, the body. If it were self, you'd be able to control it. It would be under control, okay? And by the way, you may not buy these arguments, but for now the main thing is just to lay them out. They are not intuitively clear to everyone. It's important, there's a distinction here that needs to be made, okay? When the Buddha talks about control, he's not saying apparently what we might guess that he would say about the self and control. You might guess he'd say the self is the CEO. It's the thing in control. It's the thing that asserts control. In this sermon, at least, he's saying the self should be under control. That seems to be part of his definition of a self. The self's house should be in order. Now, that may mean that there is also a controller within the self. For all we know, what he says in this sermon doesn't exclude that. And in fact, there's another sermon in which he kind of suggests as much, another discourse, and that's worth getting into just a little. I personally find it kind of amusing. It involves this character named Agavesana, who's kind of an annoying character. He denies the Buddha's teaching on the self. He says, no, feeling is self, perception is self, mental formations are self. And he confronts the Buddha. He seems to think he can win a debate with the Buddha. Now, if you want my advice, it is do not debate the Buddha on matters of Buddhist doctrine. The Buddhist scriptures are full of cases where the Buddha encounters someone who doesn't understand the doctrines or wants to deny them, and they sometimes challenge him. They never win. But in this case, he is challenged. Agavesana is sure that he can win this debate with the Buddha, so he takes him on. He repeats, yes, this is self, this is self, this is self, this is self, exactly what the Buddha denies. And here's how the Buddha handles it. He says, okay, tell me, Agavesana, a king, and even names some kings, does a king have the power within his domain to say who should be executed, who should be banished, and so on? And Agavesana says, yes, he has, and he should have that power. And the Buddha says, well, tell me, do you have the power to say of your form, of your body, let my body be like this, let my body be like that? And Agavesana falls silent. He doesn't say anything. The Buddha asks him again. Agavesana still doesn't say anything. And at this point, the Buddha brings out a rule that I didn't realize existed. He says, you have to understand, there's this rule that if someone refuses to answer a legitimate question asked by the Buddha 3 times in a row, that person's head will be split into 7 pieces. And as if to drive this point home, a spirit appears above Agavesana's head, wielding an iron thunderbolt, and threatens to split his head open. So far as I know, this is the closest that anyone has ever come to actually having their head explode, as Ajahn Chah warned, while trying to apprehend the not-self concept. And it actually didn't happen in this case. He gives in. He says, you're right. I don't have control ultimately over my body, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. So in this case, the Buddha is invoking the kind of what we would call today the CEO metaphor, the closest thing to it, the king. He does seem to be kind of associating, in a certain sense, the self with the controller, and not just asserting that it should be itself under control. But in any event, what's clear is that the Buddha says, The self is about control. The self is about kind of persistence through time, a kind of solid, some sort of solid core that persists. And these things are lacking throughout the aggregates, and that's the end of the story. Now, a lot of people find this a little unsettling. I mean, we think of ourselves as having these selves, you know, and we think there is a CEO in here. It's me, it's myself. I am in charge. And we also think that, you know, I have endured through time. You know, it's the same CEO in some sense that it was when I was 12. Well, if this interpretation is true, and I've given you kind of the standard interpretation of the Buddha's foundational discourse on the not-self, then there's bad news. Then you know, if that is your conception of the self, and if you like it, that the self is there isn't the control within you that you would maybe imagine or hope for, and there is not the permanence of self that you might have imagined. Now, you may, in addition to not buying this or resisting it, you may wonder, well, why does this matter? Let's suppose it's true. This just doesn't seem like news I can use. What do I do with this idea that the self doesn't exist? Okay, well, that's what we're going to address in the next segment, and we are going to explore the alternative interpretation to the interpretation I've just given you, and as you'll see, that may be, in a way, a more user-friendly interpretation, maybe an interpretation that does you more good, that you can get more out of.